I've been looking at some of your other amazing, amazing creative developments, mountain dwellings in Copenhagen. This was one of your first projects, was it?
Yeah, it's one of my first projects. It's essentially we were asked to design an apartment building next to a parking house, but we had to design both buildings at the same time. And we got the idea that instead of having the homes looking straight into a block of cars, to actually organize the cars on a slope, slowly ramping up, creating a south-facing side of a mountain, if you like, where all the apartments become penthouses, and they all have a large garden on the roof of the downstairs neighbor. So suddenly you make a man-made mountain of houses with gardens by actually exploring the synergy or symbiosis between the parking that wants large floors close to the ground and can have deep space, and the homes that basically want the daylight and the air and the view. So instead of trying to have one answer for everything, try to actually enjoy and explore the differences that different programs or different activities have. So when you put them together, they can actually, in a way, gravitate towards their favorite position and actually create, instead of 100 ordinary apartments with a penthouse on top, all of them become penthouses, right? Mm-hmm. And you end up almost having the suburban lifestyle of a house with a garden, but in the middle of a city setting.
Amazing. And this too is one of your earlier projects in Copenhagen.
Yeah, actually, we call it the VM house. And it's a very simple idea also. It's because from the sky, it looks like a V and an M. And it's basically by saying, instead of always making things out of rectangular boxes, if we start angling the homes, they start looking past each other instead of looking straight at each other. So the form that looks like it could be that we just wanted to make something more expressive, but what makes the building expressive or striking also makes it more enjoyable for the people living in it. So suddenly you get distant views. So it's almost like, and here in New York we're just finishing a building called the Spiral, in Hudson Yards, and it's essentially. It's almost like if you look at a typical skyscraper from before modernism, many of them have setbacks. So they look a little bit like very slender, very tall, slender cigarettes, because they have setbacks that have to do with the setback requirements of the zoning law, because the city wants to ensure that the further the taller building becomes, the more it allows light to pass down to the street. So with the Spiral, we actually created those setbacks, as you have to, but staggered them so they become a cascade of terraces all the way up to the top, like a spiral with trees and gardens. So every floor has access to its own outdoor space. But then we also have, because like a lot of companies, they occupy maybe 15 floors. So where you have the terrace, you also have a little double height space that connects to the floor above and the floor below. And statistics say that people never take the stair in a skyscraper because they have to go out through a series of doors and find the fire stair. But if you can see the stair, and if you can actually see your colleague 2 floors up, then you're not going to go take the elevator. You're going to walk up to them, and you're actually going to remember also to tell them this thing that you always wanted to tell them, but you forgot. That could make their work a little bit better. It's often the conversations by the water cooler that trigger the breakthroughs.
Plus the exercise.
And then you, of course, you get the exercise. So in some way, it's these little inventions, and you can say on each floor the terrace is, typically not much bigger than the room we sit in. Sometimes a little bit bigger, but it's an outdoor space with greenery. So if you have a phone call or a break, you can go out, and you also have a straight view to the colleagues above and below you. And as a result, the whole building has this kind of rather striking spiral around it, almost like an ornament. And again, you can say what makes the building look different is also what makes it perform differently.
Of course.
That it's not just an appearance, it's really inherent in the bones of the building that something else is possible.
Here's another building in New York, right?
Yes, exactly. This is our first building. We call it the Court Scraper. It's sort of a tetrahedron. It looks like a pyramid of sorts, but it's essentially it's a city block on the west side of Manhattan. And we thought one of the kind of anchors of public space in Europe, in Copenhagen, where I come from, is the courtyard. The courtyard is a communal space where everybody that lives around the courtyard can go down and enjoy the weather, the trees, the nature. And because it's a communal space, if you forget your tricycle or your bucket or your teddy bear in the evening, it's still going to be there in the morning, because even though you share it with hundreds of neighbors, it's everybody's communal courtyard. And we thought, what if we put that into a Manhattan city block? But of course, so it's almost like a miniature Central Park for the people living there. But then of course, if you would build like a 20, 30-story building all the way around it, no sunlight would ever come down. So as a result, the building is very asymmetrical. To the northeast, it's the height of a high-rise. But to the southwest, overlooking the river, it's literally the height of a handrail. So from the entire courtyard, and everybody who looks over the courtyard, they actually see the sun setting over the Hudson River.
That's amazing.
So you end up combining the views and the verticality of a New York skyscraper with the communality and social space of a Copenhagen courtyard.
You know, all over Europe, when you go to small villages, you have the village square where people have the equivalent of your courtyard. And even Latin America, every little place I've been to, there's this village square always. It becomes the hub where people meet, socialize, eat, play, all of that. And I think that's very much missing in our big cities, at least in the United States. By the way, Copenhagen has been a place of pilgrimage for me for the last 4 decades, because of Niels Bohr and the quantum revolution that occurred there. So it's almost like a holy place for me. I've been there many times, and last time I was there was only a few months ago. I was in Malmo, and this is the first time I saw the bridge from Sweden all the way to Copenhagen. One used to have to take the ferry in the past.
I think the bridge is also a good example of these kind of simple transformations that before the bridge was built, there was an incredible resistance against it. Or why should the state spend so much money on making a bridge? But after it opened, it has united Denmark and Sweden in a way that didn't exist before. And suddenly Copenhagen is now the capital of southern Sweden, because they're closer to Copenhagen than they are to Stockholm, right?
That's right.
So it also becomes a very direct way to facilitate a kind of social and cultural integration between two neighboring countries.
My very special guest today is Bjarke Ingels, in my opinion, the #1 creative architect whose ideas could actually save our planet. So I hope this conversation is inspiring to you, and that somehow will result in a global movement, in a critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier and joyful world. And we'll be seeking associations, partnerships, and speaking to the United Nations and other organizations as well. So I have prepared a few questions looking at your life. Let me ask you some of these. I don't know if we can get through all of them. How do you balance innovation and practicality in your architectural designs, particularly when creating structures that push boundaries.
A kind of philosophy we've applied in almost all our work is one we call hedonistic sustainability. It's basically the idea that instead of always only thinking about sustainability as a necessary compromise that you have to do because the alternative could be even worse. I think the first project we ever did in the year 2001 was the Copenhagen harbor bath that sort of extended the life of the city into the water around it. Essentially, the port of Copenhagen had become so clean that you could swim in it. So when we opened it, you just saw citizens of Copenhagen jumping in the port in the middle of the city. Instead of driving for hours to get to the Hamptons, you could literally jump in the port in the middle of town. And it became clear that a clean port is not only nice for the fish, it's amazing for the citizens. They can enjoy it. And
This is another
in 2019, we opened Copenhill. It's the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world. So clean that the steam that comes out of the chimney is cleaner than the air of Copenhagen. So we've been able to turn its facades into the tallest climbing wall on Earth, 100 meters, 300 feet, and the roof into an alpine ski slope. So you can hike and trek and downhill ski on top of a power plant that turns the waste of Copenhagen into a resource. I actually think almost like fundamentally, a lot of the dichotomies that we see in the world, in this, you mentioned like innovation versus practicality. I also like to talk about, you can also say hedonism and sustainability you could sometimes see as opposites, right? Or pragmatic utopianism, which you could also, pragmatism and utopianism, you could see it as opposites, right?
Seeming contradictions.
Seeming contradictions, exactly. And I think the oxymoron, which is essentially the idea embodied by two seemingly opposing ideas, tends to be where we go.
How we think.
And I think in that sense, very often it is by actually really diving into the practicalities and by asking questions and maybe even making stronger requirements, suddenly you force, in this case, the architecture into unusual forms. So it's actually not by disregarding the practicalities, but actually saying not only do we want to do what you normally do with a building, but we also want to make sure that you can see your upstairs and downstairs neighbors, or that every floor has access to the outside. You start making more demanding requirements, and suddenly the standard solution is no longer enough. And you force the architecture into something more performing and more interesting. The best example I can find is there's a game called Twister, which is a family game where you put a carpet out on the floor and there's different fields, and you have to put your feet, and then as the game progresses, you suddenly have to touch all these different fields at the same time, and you find yourself in backbending configurations with your face rubbing up against the body parts of other family members, and the game becomes more and more interesting by making the task more difficult, but still respecting all of the pragmatics. You force the innovation into being.
Yeah, and what seemed like a contradiction then becomes a complementarity.
No, exactly, and also, once you've made that leap, you won't see it as a contradiction anymore. You'll just see it as a new category in its own right. So these are examples that not only is the sustainable city or building better for the environment, it is also much more enjoyable for the people that get to live in it. And I think that suddenly takes it from the kind of slightly abstract but scary idea that in some future we're going to have very, very serious environmental consequences, and over to this idea, why not do it now? We have to do it anyway, but it's also going to make our cities more enjoyable and more livable.
Yeah, I was looking at all the elements of playfulness and whimsy, such as the mountain dwellings, and I think playfulness is a necessary ingredient for creativity as well.
Yeah, it's essentially it doesn't matter why someone suggests something. What matters is why we choose to pursue it. So you don't have to necessarily have intention when you are playing with ideas. You can just do it just for fun, or maybe just because this feels better. But then once you suggest it to the group, we discuss it, and we might recognize that one of the ideas seems to be doing things in a better way. It might not be why we made it, but now that we see it, it's why we end up pursuing it.
You know, there's a lot of conversation right now among social scientists on what they call emergence. And they say when you have shared vision, maximum diversity, complementing everyone's strength, and some kind of a collaborative, emotional and spiritual, ecosystem, you can solve any problem. And I've seen that collaboration seems to be a key aspect of your practice, working with various stakeholders and disciplines. How do you navigate the collaborative process to ensure that diverse perspectives enrich your final architectural outcome?
You can say that when we design something, we have a team and we convene regularly. And each time we meet, we look at all the work that has been done, all the analysis, all the massing studies, all the functional layouts, the diagrams. And we try to establish the key criteria. What are the biggest problems we have to solve? What are the greatest potentials we might want to unleash? And what are the fundamental values of this particular project? And then we look at the different ideas in the context of problems, potentials, and values. And as we select certain ideas to pursue further, almost like in an evolutionary way, we reiterate what is the kind of agenda or the kind of story of the project at this point. And then when we meet again, in a way, we look at the new things and we then reformulate the narrative of the design. And bit by bit, that means that the whole group, every team member, but also the clients when we meet with them and the consultants and the collaborators, end up being part of the formulation of, let's call it the source code or the DNA of the design.
The shared vision.
So the shared vision becomes more and more specific and tangible, so that at some point, like at no point is the team waiting for me to show up as the kind of creative director and tell them what to do. Because as the project evolves, the narrative of the design becomes more and more clear to everybody. It's in a way giving the power to every team member and the consultants and the clients, because we all now understand and see in the same way what is this project all about. Eventually, it gets a life on its own. It's a way of empowering the entire team by giving everybody access to the source code.
Right now, you're very busy designing buildings in the dense urban environment of New York City. Are there unique challenges to New York?
Yeah, I would say at the end of the day, every city, every culture has its unique set of challenges, but they're challenging in various ways. I mean, I like to say that certain things are complicated in New York, but it's a lot easier to do a 1,000-foot skyscraper in New York than it is in Copenhagen, because in Copenhagen every building is like 6 floors, right? Yeah. So I think each environment has a specific ecosystem that makes certain things possible, and I think also as an architect you also have to understand a little bit what environment you are in, that certain innovations would contribute positively in one environment, but they might actually not make any sense in another one.
Which actually brings me to what I was going to ask you. How does the architectural landscape of New York contribute to the global conversation of contemporary architecture.
In the big picture, urban density is good for the environment. Actually, the energy consumption per capita or per person comes down the more you live in dense proximity. And even though New York has a lot of shortcomings and sometimes can feel like one of the biggest third world cities in the world.
Especially the airports. After having traveled in Asia now.
No, absolutely.
The airports in the US, definitely.
No, I think maybe it's an American thing. I think Americans are great at innovation.
Third world.
But they're not very good at follow through.
Yeah.
So the metro maybe came first to New York,
Yes.
but as a result, it's one of the worst metros in the world.
It is. Even I've been to the Moscow metro and the Japan metro, and
Like they have palaces for the people. Yeah.
Palaces. Yeah.
No, but I think this idea of density as a driver, and I think that is what is striking about the mountain range that is the skyline of Manhattan. There are definitely some beautiful buildings, but the majesty of it is actually in the aggregate. It is the collective of all of these, maybe often quite mundane towers that provides a kind of majestic mountain range of peaks and valleys.
Panoramic view.
And I think also the successful coexistence of so many different points of view. It also means that there is a lot of confrontation and conflict in a city like New York, and we definitely feel that when we are trying to modify it by adding a building.
New York has a very rich architectural history too.
It is the cradle of the skyscraper.
Yeah,
that's
true. We were recently both together in Bhutan. This new project that basically you are being given the responsibility of creating the city of mindfulness in Gelfu. And you had a very good response from the king and queen and all the people who were there. I just had a question, Gelfu, where this project is supposedly going to happen. It doesn't have the ambience of the rest of Bhutan, the mountains and the forests and the monasteries and just the feeling that Bhutan gives you. How are you going to incorporate all that?
Bhutan is, as a country, is doing a lot of things very well, right? It's a small population, less than 1 million people, in a territory the size of Denmark, but basically the Himalayas, right? So from 7.5 kilometers, like what is that, 20,000 feet in the north, down to like 300 feet in the south on the border to India. And of course, when we think of Bhutan, we do think of the more alpine regions higher up in the mountains. We think of the Tiger's Nest, this kind of beautiful temple that is like hugging the side of a mountain. You have to hike there. And we also think of a culture where the history, the craft, the heritage, the ceremonies, the spirituality is omnipresent in the sort of city and the landscape and the towns. But they're also experiencing that the younger generation they're going to
Australia,
software engineers newly educated in Bhutan can actually make more money cleaning the high school corridors in Perth, and as such they actually see a lot of a big brain drain essentially. So what they're trying to do is to create a special administrative zone, 1,000 square kilometers on the border to India, bookended by 2 nature parks, in a place where you have tigers and elephants essentially roaming around, and to see if they could create a city that could have the kind of vibrancy and economic energy that the young people right now have to go to Mumbai or Perth or Singapore to find. And therefore, since a lot of the culture of Bhutan is alpine or mountainous in its architecture and in its clothing and culture. What we're trying to do is almost like reinterpret what would be the tropical equivalent of Bhutanese culture and architecture, and see if you can, on the foundation of the values that are quite unique in Bhutan. What I found most striking is like even when you go to like a public school, like with 5, 6, 7-year-olds, meditation, spirituality, sort of quite deep philosophical sort of awareness is rooted into the way that the kids are treated, which is also like every Bhutanese person I've interacted with, whether it be the driver or the cook or the kind of guide,
family.
no, or the royal family, exactly. Every walk of life has a kind of a presence that is, of course, incredibly forthcoming and helpful, but not sort of overly, serving. It's more like you feel you real three-dimensional people that are standing right there and are happy to help or engage, but with a kind of a presence that you find rare. So in that sense, I do think that what is truly unique about Bhutan, even though the visuals we associate with Bhutan is, of course, the Himalayas, what's truly unique about Bhutan, you could actually create a tropical city in the south that would be like a modern manifestation of what I find so unique about the Bhutanese culture.
So Bjarke and I were in Bhutan recently, and we attended, at the invitation of the King and Queen, and we attended the 117th birthday celebration of the Kingdom of Bhutan. There were 50,000 people in that stadium, and at the end of that whole ceremony, the King and Queen, you and I, and 50,000 people danced together. There was no security. There was no hint of, any anxiety or anything of the sort. I've never experienced that in my life.
No, like they have
and the humility of the King and Queen as well.
No, absolutely. Like there is they may not be an economic superpower, but they have another kind of power, which is exactly this power that that everybody can converge towards something. Also, the country has, I think what is like 5 or 10% of the country are volunteers. So they have this kind of huge core of volunteers, because the king asked them, and these volunteers became incredibly instrumental in the entire COVID response, for instance, which meant that Bhutan handled COVID better than any other nation on earth. So in that sense, there is we are used to measuring everything in economic terms. And I think it is no coincidence that Bhutan came up with the idea of measuring gross national happiness rather than gross national product. And therefore, I think I'm fascinated by this idea that there is another way to mobilize a nation and instigate change that you can't account in economic terms, even though it will have economic impact and it will create benefit and welfare for the nation.
That when I was there were two parts of me. One, overjoyed by the experience, and the other, heartbroken over what's happening in the world with violence, whether it's Ukraine, Middle East, India, Pakistan, you name it, Korea. When you see a country here where that would be unimaginable, almost, the violence that we're seeing in the world right now. So I hope people can take some inspiration from what Bhutan is doing.
No, there's definitely some lessons to be had. Like this was my fourth encounter with the king and his team. So it's a relatively recent effort. The kind of master plan framework for the Gelefu, the mindfulness city. In order to ensure we root the design for the city in the culture of Bhutan, we're establishing a local office in Thimphu and Gelefu, where we can, in a way, harness also the power of the people that will, in a way, allow us to share and co-develop these designs with the local talent mass, but also a local talent mass that will remain at some point if we go on to do other things. I mean, I have a feeling we're going to have a long-standing journey together with the Bhutanese, but in a way that we end up also kind of rooting that the talents we attract stay in Thimphu and in Bhutan.
And bring talents like you there too.
No, absolutely.
Tell me about this. This is an extraordinary book that comes from you and your colleagues. And I've been going through it and can't get enough of it. Tell us a little bit about this book.
It's called Formgiving. And formgivning is the Danish word for design. And as you can hear, it literally means form giving, because to design is to give form to that which has not yet been given form.
From the formless.
Exactly. Out of nothing, something. And that means, because when you're designing a building or a city or a space, you're giving form to the world that you would like to find yourself living in the future. So it's really about giving form to the future. So we try to organize, and it's essentially like a lot of the work we've been doing over the last decade, and we try to sort of organize it in a journey from the past, in a way sort of, and we try to describe the evolution or the taking shape of making, sensing, sustaining, thinking, healing, and moving, which I think are somehow the main challenges. And we try to describe how did the possibility of making things evolve, and then looking at the present, essentially, what are we involved in now, and then we try to sort of give an idea of the future. Of course, we're going to go to other planets. We're working with NASA and a company called Icon.
Yeah. So there's a whole section here on what the future might hold on the moon, on Mars, and of course on Earth. You know, in our conference, Sages and Scientists at Harvard, September 14th and 15th, where you will be part of a panel, probably leading it, we also have people who designed the software for the Mars landing, etc., from MIT Media Lab.
Amazing.
I think that'll be a great conversation because not only are they designing the software for the landing, but possibly future architecture and clothing and designs of that sort. So this has been an amazing conversation. And, you know, forever I've thought that the difference between happy people and unhappy people is something called, the brain response to what we call problems. When you see a problem, the first thing is to reframe it as a challenge, but then reframe the challenge as an opportunity. And Bjarke Ingels is the perfect example of that. Check out everything we've talked about and give us your feedback. And Bjarke, that was an amazing conversation.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure.
Yeah.